Ottawa, capital of Canada, where brilliant October sunshine and the heraldry of autumn leaves give royal color to a royal welcome. Escorted by red-coated men of the mounted police, they arrive at Confederation Square for the first and most solemn ceremony of their visit to the capital.
It's important. We usually focus, when we're talking about our Constitution, people usually think of our statutes and our major constitutional acts. But there's also unwritten practices and conventions that are also very, very important and that bind us together. And these public occasions are the unlegislated ways of bringing people together and arriving at a common purpose. And that's why when the Queen goes on one of these tours, it's so important. She's really trying to bind people together. These public ceremonies that the state now has to organize are really there to take the place of what was once carried out by established churches. For man's pretty well entire history, up until a couple of centuries ago, man was always a religious being. Man always found his fulfillment as part of a larger order or cosmos. Well, the established churches faced many different challenges. One of the challenges that they've always had is that, of course, just repeating the same ceremonies, just going through the same forms, there's always a danger that the meaning will be lost. Beginning in the Renaissance, man felt the need to actually adhere freely to the norms that he was expected to comply with. And of course, in the history of Europe, we saw religious wars, really civil wars of a religious nature that occurred, where members of society were fighting over the definitions and the norms often contained in these religious services. In order for the civil wars to come to an end, the state had to, in a way, oblige all the churches, or prevent all the churches from exercising a monopoly on public ceremonies. While there have been poets all through the ages, the role of poetry, I think, became more important once you had this vacuum created by the departure of established churches from the public realm. And that's where the sublime, the notion of the sublime came up. Because the sublime would be poetry's way of achieving some of the goals the traditional religion achieved. Perhaps no one has achieved such a sublime effect as Mozart. At that time, you had the cultivation of the sublime, people seeking this very noble and uplifting effect, whether it's in music or in poetry or even to a certain extent in the visual arts. So we have the beginnings in the second half of the 18th century of these two different movements, the Romantic and the Neoclassical. They are both dealing with emotions. They're both seeking to create new communities. They're both trying to take the place of established religion. The chief difference between the two movements is that the Romantics are quite content to let the emotions, to give the emotions free rein, believing that that's the way that one can really express oneself. The Neoclassicists, on the other hand, believe that that emotional expression always takes place within an order that is in accordance with reason. In one sense, the history really of the 19th century is the history of the triumph, in a way, of the Romantic movement. And the German nationalist movement of the beginning of the 19th century is really the prototype of the public Romantic community. And so nationalism, which is still such a great force in the world today, all the various waves of nationalism, all the various nationalist movements that we've seen throughout the 20th century and in the 19th, hark back to that prototypical German Romantic nationalist movement. Where there is no public liturgy, where there are no ceremonies that allow for an educated emotional expression, human beings themselves will feel this vacuum and fill it on their own. What we see, especially in the countries of the West, are young people who in fact create their own sort of romantic communities around the cult of celebrities, whether those celebrities are from the popular music, whether they're in movies, or whether they're from sports. That's why we're very fortunate in Canada with a constitutional monarch who's not an elected politician, who doesn't have the same ambitions an elected politician does. They, or the constitutional monarch or her representative, is ideally placed to be able to capture that sense of participating in a larger whole.
They would speak to them all if they could, but not one of the disabled veterans is overlooked. And then as Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh leave the War Memorial and return to their car, as the procession moves away from Confederation Square, the pent-up enthusiasm of waiting thousands finds release. The autumn air is filled with cheers, and the massed crowds break surging through the streets.